Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I just want to say welcome to everyone. And we hope that you're certainly having a great day so far. Today's APP prep webinar is focused on the topic of how you all can support the youth in your programming who have experienced grief, loss, and trauma. And so today's presentation is coming to you from Roberta's House. Roberta's House is a community-based nonprofit and family grief support center based in Baltimore, Maryland. And they have a long history of providing bereavement support in the city and working with youth and families. But of course, they'll share more information about themselves in just a moment. So we're really looking forward to the information that they have prepared for us today. With that said, we can go on to the next slide, and I'll just pass it on to Patrick for a couple of housekeeping reminders.
Yep, thanks, Chloe. This is Patrick with RTI. I'll be helping out with the virtual room today. Just a quick note that when you log in, your microphone is automatically muted. If you have any questions for presenters today, please submit those into the chat window. You can also click the raise hand button to let us know you'd like to unmute and ask your question verbally. If you run into any screen freezes or it seems like the audio is lagging, turning off your video may help. We do have time reserved for question and answer at the end, and the transcript and recording will be available after the webinar. So at this time, I'll turn the meeting over to Annette and Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. And excited to actually present this information to you. I am now going to share my screen. So the title of our presentation today is titled Grief, an Epidemic Within the Pandemic, Empowering Children, Youth, and Families in Urban Communities to Work Through Their Grief and Trauma. COVID-19 has not only dramatically changed the way we live, it has also impacted how we die and how we grieve. With more and more Americans who died in ICU settings, away from family, and more funerals were held virtually, the pandemic has seriously curtailed normal expressions of grief and cultural mourning. Given the CDC guidelines for funerals and social distancing, simple human touch was restricted and was no longer a mitigating force against prolonged grief. So while the pandemic has a face and a name, we point to a second, more silent, yet potentially equally devastating one, and that is unacknowledged grief. We may have discovered a vaccine, but we have not really addressed how to help the millions who will now have or experience complicated or traumatic grief. Want to introduce my colleague that will be presenting with me, Veronica Land Davis, who is a licensed social worker, clinician, and she is the executive director of executive director of Roberta's House. And myself, I'm Annette March-Grier, president and co-founder of Roberta's House. Is a newly constructed state-of-the-art center that Roberta's House has just recently moved into. We moved into our new facility in February of 21. It was actually constructed during the pandemic, and we're so blessed that it was, because prices have tripled since the time that we started our construction. Roberta's House was founded in 2007, and it was named after Julia Roberta March, who is the matriarch of the March family, who is one of the largest funeral service providers on the East Coast. Roberta, who is also my mother, cared and supported thousands of families as a funeral director here in Baltimore. And she was very well known and recognized for her compassion and loving spirit. Our mission is that Roberta's House provides trauma-informed care and addresses grief as a public health service. We believe that all children, adults, and families suffering the loss or death of someone special deserve to have support and a safe place to heal and recover. And our vision is that children, adults, and families who experience the loss are able to transform their despair to hope, become healthy, and ultimately we create safer communities. Thank you, and now I'm going to turn it over to Veronica Land Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our objectives for our time together this afternoon, we have several objectives that we want to work with you on. One is we want to define this thing called grief and trauma in urban communities, especially with children and youth that are exposed to poverty, violence, and death. We want to examine the different types of stress reactions and grief and trauma, identify how children and youth experience this thing called grief and loss. We want to explore with you this afternoon healthy adjustment and adaptation theories to support bereaved children and youth. And we want to have a discussion, and we want to discuss healthy coping strategies and ways we as professional caregivers can support bereaved children and youth. So looking at grief, loss, and trauma, and being able to work with our children who are 9 and over and younger children, it is important that we spend some time this afternoon to look at the external issues that our children and families are dealing with. And one deals with poverty and poverty living. What we have learned is that families living in poverty often encounter multiple traumas over many years. And furthermore, they are less likely than families in more affluent communities to have access to resources that may facilitate the successful negotiation of their traumatic experience. Yet, many families and individuals have difficulty adapting, and we see this often here at Roberta's House. Grief brings our families to our doors, but they come with multiple experiences of trauma. So when we look at this thing called grief, loss, and trauma, and as an epidemic, we have to spend some time looking at the disparities. What we have found is when we look at African-American or Black youth, their lifespans are shorter than our Caucasian fellows. They're more likely to experience premature death. Our young people are more likely to experience a death of a close family member or relative. And what we're starting to see is the homicide rate has begun to increase for our African-American or Black children, and this versus Caucasian victims of homicide. Historically, the unemployment rate for Blacks or Afro-Americans has been approximately twice the rate for Caucasian. So what we see is that this is the case today, that 6% of our Black African-American workers and 3.1% for Caucasian workers. What is also important as we continue to look at grief as an epidemic within a pandemic is that Black Americans, especially our children, are 3 times as likely to live in poverty than as their Caucasian peers and children. So what I wanted to do is really, what we want to do this afternoon is really help you to understand what the information is sharing with us about childhood bereavement. And what we've learned is that we estimate that 5.6 million children in the United States will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by the age of 18. And what I want to do is put this context in another way, just so that we can walk away and understanding that 1 in 13 children will experience a death of a parent or sibling by the time they reach the age of 18. And if we kind of look at an analogy, what comes to mind is the largest NFL stadium in the United States holds about 82,000 participants that can sit in the stadium. This means that the largest stadium in the United States cannot accommodate all the children who are experiencing grief, loss, and trauma by the death of parents or their siblings. So what this means is that in order for 5.6 million bereaved children, we would have to build almost 68 stadiums to accommodate all the bereaved children here in the United States. So we're talking about a lot of children who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma that we as professional caretakers really have to stop, hold space, and really begin to figure out how do we serve so many children that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. And what I want to say, these are the documented number of children that we know of that are dealing with sibling and parental losses, but we haven't even documented the number of children that are dealing with undocumented losses and losses that are dealing with other important and significant others like friends, like cousins, like other significant people in their lifespan. So what you see before you is what childhood bereavement looks like here in the United States. So California, the information shows us that California has the lowest rate of childhood bereavement and West Virginia has the highest. And we try to figure this out, what's going on between the West Coast and the East Coast. Well, West Virginia has the highest, and what we can attribute this to is, again, poverty. What we know is the lack of resources for the children and families that live in the West Virginia area and the political climate. All plays a role in how children deal with grief, loss, and trauma, as well as the nurturing environment that our children need so desperately in order to deal with the healing process. So just want to show you what it looks like, what America looks like when we're dealing with childhood bereavement. So we want to take time this afternoon just to give you some update on what does this look like? What are the causes of death? So this chart kind of takes us through that process. What we know is that children who have lost a loved one are more at risk than their non-bereaved counterparts for depression, anxiety, increase in illness and accidents. You know, we as educators, we as researchers and counselors, we all agree that providing supportive services for our grieving children is necessary to address those high risk factors, to decrease the risk of isolation, and to follow kids to express themselves and share with others in their own time, in their own way. So if we really look at this, we're looking at accidents. And what I want to share is that we're also including overdoses as an accident, COVID-19, homicide, heart disease, suicide, and diabetes. But what I want us to also is begin to look at what has occurred between 2015 and 2020. If you begin to really look at the data, we're seeing that there's not a decrease, there's an increase in the number of children that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. And as we deal with this thing called COVID-19, as we begin to collect data, I would estimate that we're going to see this number increase even higher when the data comes out next year. So when we're dealing with children that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, again, we want you just to hold space to think about how many children have come across your pathway in your professional journey that have dealt with accidents, that have dealt with homicides, that have dealt with heart disease, suicide, or diabetes. And we have never stopped to think about maybe grief, loss, and trauma are some of the issues that our children are dealing with. So as we move on, and let's not forget the analogy about the stadium. Who are the children? Where are they? So we are still looking at 1 in 5 children would experience the death of someone close to them by the age of 18. Significant. 86 to 92% of our young people in drug rehabilitation treatment, they have experienced and have shared with us that they experienced the death of at least someone that was very important to them. And what really grabs my attention that I really want to share with you is that in a poll of 1,000 high school juniors and seniors, 90% indicated they had experienced the death of a loved one. So here we are, 90% of our high school juniors and seniors have experienced the death of a loved one. So as we continue to kind of figure out how do we deal with this 5.6 million children that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, it is important as professional caregivers that we remember that 1 out of every 20 children age 15 and younger, 1 out of every 20 children age 15 and younger will suffer the loss of one or both parents. Now, this data, this information really doesn't take into account for other parental figures, such as grandparents or other relatives who provided care for our children and youth. So going back and kind of looking at the 5.6 million and now looking at 1.5 million children are living in a single parent's household because of the death of one parent. And I just want to hold space just for a second. One of the things that we're seeing here at Roberta's house is that many times, especially our families that are survivors of homicide victims, where there were 2 household figures of parental guidance. Now, many of our families here at Roberta's house, there's one single parent who now has to readjust and learn how to parent without their significant other. So it is estimated that 73,000 children die every year in the United States. And of those 73,000 children, 83% have surviving siblings. So, and if we take the rule that for every death, it impacts 10 people, there's a lot of people who are dealing with grief, trauma, and loss as a pandemic and epidemic here in the United States. So I wanted to also bring to your attention that, there was a national survey among classroom teachers, and they had to also discuss what is their knowledge around serving the students in their classrooms who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. And it's very interesting what the survey revealed. The survey revealed that many of the educators found like they had saw children and their students in their classroom that were having difficulties concentrating in class. And for many of these educators, they had observed about 87% of the teachers are saying that this is what they're saying when children come into the classroom who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. They're noticing that the young people are withdrawal, they have disengagement and less participation. Many kids don't come to school when they're dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. Teachers learning have found that, at least through this survey, that there was a decrease in the quality of work that the students were able to perform. They had or demonstrated less reliability in turning in assignments. And what really struck me was that 7 and 10 teachers, that 69% of the teachers who took the survey currently have at least one student in their classes who had lost a parent, guardian, sibling, or close friend in the past year. Not in the past 2 years, in the past year. Definitely something that our teachers and educators are dealing with. So when we're dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, it is important that we call, unfortunately, many times we've noticed that our children are the silent mourners. They are the ones that we do not think about when we're talking about this pandemic. So children coping with a loss are pandemic's forgotten grievance. And what I am happy to share with you that there is a bipartisan group led by 2 former governors who they are urging President fighting to really help with funding so that they can serve an estimated 200,000 children who have lost parents or caregivers. Now, again, we're only dealing with parents or caregivers. Imagine if we add those numbers of grieving children who are dealing with other significant others. So from March 2020 to the last April 2021, over 1 million children worldwide lost a mother, a father, a grandparent, or another adult that they relied on as a primary caregiver to COVID-19. And again, as we continue to collect the data, I think we're going to see the information and the data become even more grim as we continue to learn about this thing called COVID-19 and how it has impacted the forgotten grievers, which are our children and adolescents. So, it's important that you really connect children and youth living in toxic environments with understanding what the ACEs are. And for those of us that are familiar with the ACEs, I just wanted to remind us, and those of us who are not, that the adverse childhood experiences, which is called ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occurred in childhood. ACEs can include violence, abuse, growing up in a family with mental health or substance abuse problems. Toxic stress for ACEs can change brain development. And we're going to talk a lot about that later on and how the body responds to stress. So ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illnesses, and substance misuse in adulthood. However, ACEs can be prevented. And so we really want to talk about how do we work with our children that are living in toxic environment, who have a lack of functional secondary family system. Many of our children are dealing with intimate violence, community violence, and that's when we come into that whole communal kind of loss, grief, and trauma. Our children are exposed to drugs and pervasiveness of dependency and abuse. We worry all the time about the educational institution and that are they really preparing our children? And the chronic and distrust of parents, teachers, and other authority figures. All of the things that our children are dealing with and living with in toxic environment, which does impact their ability to heal. So as we move forward, I wanted to kind of take some time to talk about the kinds of trauma. So we know ACEs identifies where our kids are, and we know what happens to us as children impacts us as adults. So those of us that are working as the professional caregivers for children and adults, it's important that we intervene now so that we can have a more positive impact on our children as adults. So here's some typical kinds of trauma that unfortunately our young people are dealing with. So death, the loss of dealing with the death, traumatic grief, incarceration, and we haven't even dealt with this afternoon. That's another type of webinar when you're talking about the non-losses that does not or do not deal with physical death, because our children deal not only with the physical death, but they and grief, but they also dealing with grief from the non-death perspective. So physical abuse, crime, substance abuse, school violence. Now, we didn't add this on the chart, but I do think it's important to talk about bullying and how that impacts trauma on our young people. We've had many kids that come through Roberta's house. I remember one young lady who came through us and her father was murdered. So she definitely was a survivor of homicide victim. And she talked about how she was being bullied in the classroom as a result of the community being aware of the circumstances around her father's death. So housing instability, living in standardized housing, house fires, and an intergenerational history of trauma in families. All the things that are multiple experiences that our children are dealing with as we deal with the epidemic within the pandemic here in urban settings. So other kinds of traumas our young people are experiencing, they witnessed or were involved in a traumatic event. I can't tell you how many families that I've had the privilege of working with that have shared that either they were there when their loved one were murdered, or they also escaped that incident in which they were almost killed in the process. Other kinds of trauma, the arriving upon the scene of the event, secondary trauma. Now, especially if you're dealing with suicide and the person died in the home, and we had a young lady who her sister was her twin died, she by suicide, and she was the one who discovered her sibling. So other kinds of trauma, the here, near miss were almost involved in an event that I just talked about. Knew or know others who were killed, harmed, or involved in some kind of way. Other kind of traumas that our young people experience is having a relationship with friends or families or victims. It's that vicarious trauma. Having a lot or have heard a lot about the event through media or friends, COVID-19. I can remember when we first had this epidemic that was going on across the world, and people were tied to the TV and being re-traumatized and re-traumatized. And so what we encourage our families is to turn off the TVs so that you would not experience trauma over and over again. And lastly, but definitely not least, our children are dealing with and are confronted with are reminders of other traumatic incidents in their life by an event. So these are the type of traumas that our young people walk through Roberta's house doors, dealing with and trying to work through their healing process. So like grief, one person's trauma cannot impact or can impact the entire family and community. And like grief, trauma is an individual journey. So what we've learned is that repeated exposure can lead to severe chronic reaction in multiple families. And so some of the things that we're seeing our families deal with is the post-traumatic stress or the urban traumatic stress disorder. And I just wanted to take time. The difference is urban traumatic stress disorder is really the continuous daily stress that our young people are dealing with on a daily basis and not post. So trauma affects the entire family, the adult intimate relationships, parent-child relationships, many times are compromise, mistrust, parental withdrawal, understanding of the child's needs, especially when families and parents are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. They're trying to get through their own understanding and making meaning of what happened. Trauma affects our entire family through the parenting experience, sibling relationships, and we can't discount the intergenerational trauma. And we really, when adults with history of childhood abuse and exposed to family violence have problems with emotional regulation, we see this aggression. So at the end of the day, the whole family as a whole is impacted by the chronic conditions of high stress and exposure to multiple trauma, often experience chaotic and disorganized lifestyle. We see this with our families that come through our doors. They're dealing with multiple stressors. They're dealing with urban traumatic stress, and it impacts the entire family. So when we're dealing with developmental impact of trauma, it's important that we as professional caregivers remain understanding that trauma really derails healthy development. It derails our ability to learn, our perception, our cognitive ability, our personality. All of this our children are dealing with. They are trying to connect with healthy relationships, what they struggle with. They struggle with the awareness that he or she has the capability and the capacity to have an impact, a positive impact on this world. And again, a lot of the developmental impact of trauma, what we've learned here at Roberta's house, again, how one deals with trauma or the experiences of the events the experiences and the effect when one is little impacts what happens with developmental trauma as our young people grow. And one of the things that we learn is when we're dealing with developmental trauma from the young group, is generally exhibited internally. But those of us that are working with children that are in middle school and higher, the onset is quite different and it's more acting out versus the inward. So as professional caregivers, we really do have to take time to kind of look at that. And we want to make sure that there's some emotional regulations going on for our young people. And what I mean by that is to effectively exert control over our emotions through a wide range of approaches. And this is important as professional caregivers, that we may feel sad and help our children understand that sometimes we may feel sad when we lose someone. We may be frustrated over traffic or even angry at the person that died. But these emotions can be more volatile for some people and some youth, that they may have high and lows and often spin out of control. So one of the things we try to do is, and Annette is going to talk more about this, is helping our young people with their fight, flight, and freeze responses so that the impact of the trauma looks different, feels different, and they know that the trauma does not define who they are. So the inability to regulate can lead to damaged relationship, danger, or just poor social skills for our young people. Okay, so moving on, as we look at trauma, here are some triggers. As you work with your families, as you work with the children and the youth in your different programs, here's some triggers for children who have experienced developmental trauma. So their perception or lack of power or control, especially with children who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, especially if the death was traumatic. Many of our kids are dealing with the lack of power or control that had happened into their families due to the death. The unexpected changes, they are feeling threatened or attacked, they feel vulnerable or frightened, feeling shame, feeling of deprivation or need, and intimacy and positive attention. And just quickly, I'd just like to highlight a couple. One is, especially with children who are survivors of homicide victims, what we've learned is that safety and trust are important in the healing process. And that trigger of not feeling safe and not feeling trusted and having a nurturing adult leads our children to be threatened. They are vulnerable, they are frightened, and they live in that fight, flight, and freeze world all the time, going back to that urban stressors that our families, our children are dealing with on a daily basis. So as we continue to move on, one of the things that we wanted to get into is the grief of an epidemic. And I'm going to pass the baton to Annette, in which she's going to take us now into the second half of our journey. We've talked about, the statistics and the action for the information that I've given out today. Our action and our call to action for you guys is to really take the information, really begin to look at how many children that you're serving that may be dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. And how do we begin to work with those children to heal in a positive way? Annette?
Okay. Thank you, Veronica, for that information. I do believe that understanding the stats and just the specific details around, so many children that are grieving in our country, we really don't pay enough attention as to these children being grievers. And also, I hope that the information that Veronica provided you gave you a better understanding as to why you may see some of the children responding the way that they do. we oftentimes see these stress reactions or traumatic responses when children are constantly fighting with each other. They get very excited or emotional about very little things with another student or another child or adult, like, stepping on their shoe, or just little things that their behavior just seems heightened about the things that they do. Also, we wonder why parents don't keep appointments or don't follow through with some of the services that you provide. And we see where parents, we may think that they're just not responsible or don't care about their children. But as we just heard Veronica share and talk about, a lot of it has to do with the multiple traumatic experiences and the stress that exist in these families, that there's a lot of just disorganization. So I think this kind of gives us sort of the foundation of understanding that people come with a lot of history and a lot of background and experiences in their lives that sometimes they cannot control. And it impacts their mental health and their well-being and their safety and their stability. So that was really the purpose of us giving you this information beforehand. So now we're going to talk specifically about the grief epidemic. And I tell you, if people had not experienced grief before the pandemic, people surely have experienced grief now and have lost or known someone who has lost someone close. And so it is definitely an epidemic, which is an event or disease or something that affects a large number of people, a community, or even a region. So we have to pay attention to this, because the pandemic has really, there's going to be a great aftermath of the magnitude of loss and how people grieve through this time now, because will last a long time. It will definitely last a long time. So let's talk a little bit about a definition of grief here. Grief refers to the process of experiencing and working through the psychological, behavioral, social, and physical reactions to the perception of loss. And that word perception stands out very uniquely, because each person's grief experience is determined by their perception of that loss. And that is why grief is so unique and it's universal. It's a natural reaction to loss, and grief is influenced by also the nature of the loss. There's several theories that we have learned to practice when we talk about grief healing. Many of you may be familiar with Kubler-Ross, who is actually the founder of the dying process, the grief stages. Her theory has been unfortunately misused and misinterpreted, because when she talked about stages, it was really misinterpreted as if people actually go through a particular stage through their grief healing process, which is not so. Grief is very messy. Grief is unpredictable. Grief is a roller coaster ride for individuals. And so we don't fit in these little neat boxes as we work through our grief process. It's unpredictable and it's uncontrollable. So her theory was written many, many years ago, and it was actually while she was preparing for her own death. And as psychologists and psychiatrists studied this more, they really adapted new theories that was based around the adaptation and adjustment theories. And so these individuals now are very well known about, their writings and their articles and their books on grief and healing and grief with children and grief with adults. And I'd just like to throw some of these names at you so you can research some of them. William Wharton, Robert Nehemiah, Therese Rando, Kenneth Doka, and Alan Wolfelt. Particularly Alan Wolfelt is an expert in the field of children's grief and loss. So you may want to spend a little bit of time looking him up and reading some of his materials and books. In fact, Roberta's house uses a lot of its exercises and activities, and its curriculum is based around Alan Wolfelt's theories and William Wharton's theories. And so we talk about healing. I think it's good that we have a clear understanding of what healing refers to. Healing means that we're able to integrate the grief or traumatic experience into self and learn to continue a changed life with the fullness and meaning. And that's defined by Alan Wolfelt. So to integrate our experiences and to learn to continue a changed life with fullness and meaning is the essential goal when we talk about healing through grief. Healing also is defined as to restore to health or soundness, cure, to ease or relieve distress, emotional distress, or to set things right, repair, and to heal. It's important for us also to understand resilience, because resilience is a practice or something that we want our children and individuals to have. Some people define resilience as bouncing back, which is also a false belief. Because once we experience something in life, once we go through a traumatic experience, especially, we are never the same person as we were before that experience. Life is a series of learning lessons, so we really never bounce back. So we define resilience as the process of, or the capacity for, or the outcome of successful adaptation despite challenging or threatening circumstances. So successful adaptation may manifest in many ways, and often in ways that even seem counterintuitive to us. For instance, a child who is labeled manipulative or a liar, which is a common description for a neglected child, is often a child who has successfully adapted to a world in which its needs are not met by finding ways to meet those needs. So a child who appears emotionally shut down may also be a child who has successfully adapted to a failure of caretaking by minimizing access to emotional experience. So what we see sometimes as being maladaptive behavior is really the child or the youth's way of adjusting and adapting to its environment or to its circumstances that it has learned to live in. And it starts at a very young age, very young age. As it says in this picture, it's just the beginning with our toddlers. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on Alan Wolfelt to help you understand what we call the task of mourning, or the 6 essential reconciliation needs of a mourning child. And these don't go in any particular order. Let me make that very clear. There's no particular order. A child or youth may be working on all of these tasks at the same time. But this is the task in order, that is considered healthy adaptation. And it's not an easy task. It is not an easy journey. It's not an easy journey for an adult, and it's not an easy journey for a youth or a child either. So the first is to acknowledge the reality of the loss. Acknowledging the reality may be attending the funeral. It may be getting the news that their loved one or the special person has died and learning to adjust to not having that person physically in the house anymore, or not being able to talk with them. Acknowledgement is also storytelling, allowing the youth or the child to share their story about their loss, how the person died, when they died, what happened, and all of the details around it. They have to build their own narrative, and building their narrative and telling their story is part of the acknowledgement process. And what parents and the caregivers often try to do is to avoid the topic and not allow the child or the youth to share for fear of upsetting, which is really keeping the youth from expressing themselves and acknowledgement. So encouraging them to talk is important. They also need to move toward the pain of the loss while being nurtured physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So what does this mean? The pain of grief is unavoidable. It's no way of getting around it. It's no way of eliminating. In fact, most people try to avoid the pain and they self-medicate, and this can be very dangerous. Even a teenager may try to self-medicate because of the emotional pain. Pain comes with grief. And pain also, I always say that pain has a purpose. First, it reminds us that we have to shift. We have to adjust our way of doing things. We have to adjust maybe even our belief systems about the world around us, where, if it's safe or not safe. It's painful in a sense that the emotional pain leads to the physical pain, and the youth may complain of a lot of physical aches and pains. And really, pain just reminds us something is out of order, something is out of balance, and we have to make some adjustments. And so embracing that pain is by understanding that grieving is a painful experience and it's a normal experience, and allowing those emotional pains to exist and learning some new coping skills to deal with that pain. And we'll talk about that later. The young person also has to convert the relationship with the person who has died from one of presence to one of memory. We do a lot of exercises here at Roberta's house to help our young people do that. It may be making a collage, a memory photo, or a memory box, photo album, or a memory box where they have keepsakes of the loved one to keep. It's a way of honoring the person through memory. Sometimes families will have anniversary celebrations around birthdays or holidays, remembering their loved ones. These are all traditions and practices that are encouraged because we never really lose the memory of our loved ones. They're always with us in spirit and in heart. And oftentimes the fear of having to forget our loved one is what causes more grief than need. And so to understand that it's okay to keep our memories and to honor our memories and to even celebrate our loved ones is very important. Our young people also need to develop a new self-identity based on the life without the person who has died. The self-identity is the first that's usually attacked when we lose someone close or experience a loss. Why me? God doesn't love me. The world hates me. I'm not worthy. Our self-esteem is really hit hard when we experience the death of someone dear or close to us. And so rebuilding this self-identity is really critical. With young people, they may express things like, you know, I want to make mom proud. I want to make daddy proud. I want to do this in life. Maybe I'll become a doctor to cure a disease. These are the ways that young people can find meaning in their loss and also redevelop their self-identity to be one that's more positive. Relate to the experience of the death to the context of meaning. Making meaning is an important part of the grief and healing process. This is both for youth and adults. You know, we have a term or cliche that we say there's a reason to everything. Sometimes there is no reason, but we try hard in making reason for things that happen. More importantly, what we really need to help young people not do is to blame themselves. Young people have a tendency to blame themselves of the death, just like we do. You know, if I only could have been there, if I had said this or not said that, maybe if I had, you know, obeyed mom or got better grades in school or not hung out with the wrong people and stressed them out, whatever it might have been, young people will blame themselves for the death. And we really need to clear this up and find out what meaning that they are identifying with this death. And it's no harm to ask, you know, what sense do you make of this? What meaning do you make of this loss or this death, to find out? Because if it goes unacknowledged or unexpressed, it can lead to adult mental health problems, substance abuse, violence. You know, they begin to do self-harm. And so we really need to help them identify their context of meaning about the event. The last is to experience a continued supportive presence of an adult in future years. And this is so important because many people think that because a child may have lost someone at an early age, that they forget about it, not to remind them on special occasions. Absolutely not. A child will remember their loved one, mom or dad, at graduation, special events at school, parent day, holidays and anniversaries, and they need that continued support. They need to acknowledge mom, dad, brother, sister, whoever the person is that has died, and to remember them and honor them in a special way, and to allow those tears to flow and to write letters. All kinds of activities can be done to give them that support. So these are the 6 reconciliation needs for mourning for young people. And you can find out more about these under Alan Wolfelt's readings and documents. And so normal childhood grief, what does that look like? You may see a child feeling very sad. They may have deep sleep problems just as adults. And those sleep problems are very real because of fear and also their fight and flight response that kicks in. They may have a loss of appetite, decreased interest in family and friends. They can develop physical complaints, stomach aches, headaches, migraines. They are not making this up. These are all most often the stress reactions due to their grief. They can cling to parents more simply because they're fearful of losing someone else or another family member. If death can take someone away so quickly, then maybe death will take someone else away from them. Irritability, trouble concentrating in school, preoccupied with the death, remembering it over and over again. And they're trying to adapt to a new life, and it's very difficult for them as well. So in both normal childhood grief, also called uncomplicated grief, childhood and childhood traumatic grief, children typically feel these emotions and feelings. In both normal and traumatic grief, these symptoms may develop, and temporary physical complaints, or they may regress, sometimes returning to behaviors as if they were small children again, bedwetting, thumb sucking, and others. Both groups of children may be irritable or withdrawn. So other behaviors could be hiding their feelings, especially with teens. Teens are very embarrassed when they have someone close die in their families and their friends learn about it. They feel embarrassed if someone dies, as I said before, fear of being different. They have difficulty expressing their feelings because they don't want to appear weak. And be bullied by their friends. They're most likely to express anger and impulsive behavior. They want to be in control and believe they are in control of their emotions. They do get very upset at parents and adults and care providers because they have trusted that adults can control things and fix things. And when we can't, they become very upset. And they try to take control in their own hands. They may even become passive aggressive in these instances where they want to see if the adults or the care providers really do have control. So they start pushing those buttons. Give you a little understanding about childhood traumatic grief, sometimes called CTG. And childhood traumatic grief is a condition that some children develop after the death of a close friend or family member. Children with childhood traumatic grief experience the cause of that death as horrifying or terrifying, whether the death was sudden or unexpected or due to even a natural cause. So similar to trauma, what may be traumatic for one isn't necessarily traumatic for another, but on the other hand, it could be traumatic for one and not traumatic for the other. So the distinguishing feature of childhood traumatic grief is that trauma symptoms interfere with the child's ability to work through those 6 tasks that I just talked about. In this condition, even happy thoughts and memories of the person reminds the child of the way the person died or what happened. They may have intrusive memories about the death that are shown by maybe having nightmares, feeling guilty, self-blame, thoughts about, the horrible way that the person died. And these kids may show signs of avoidance and numbing, such as withdrawing or not showing any emotions whatsoever, as if the person had never died. So what are your roles as caregivers and providers? How well the child will adjust is determined, believe it or not, by the functioning level of the caregiver. So in other words, how well the parents do or the care providers in the home will determine how well the children will do or the youth. The adults model coping and adjusting. And if mom can't get up out of the bed and can't function, then it's a very likelihood that the young adults or the young children will not be able to adjust and adapt in a healthy way either. So it's important to learn the child's language. Sometimes we have to help give them language for their feelings and their words, especially for those young kids who Veronica talked about that have difficulty with emotional regulation. They need to find words to place with their feelings. Recognize their behaviors and triggers and help them to recognize their triggers. Read their cues and respond in a way that helps them manage their emotions, cope with distressing situations, and make good decisions. And there's a video that we're going to watch a little later that really talks about that, how it's important that we don't immediately chastise or yell or fuss at a young person when we see them acting out or showing inappropriate behavior, but we connect with them first and bring it to their attention, and then try to give them some alternative ways of acting out. Allow them to vent and express their thoughts, feelings, and fears. Now with teens, sometimes this can be challenging because, again, remember that they don't want to be embarrassed and they feel embarrassed about their feelings. And so sometimes telling a story that you may have experienced something similar and sharing some of your feelings can help open them up. Remember that safety and security are the most important needs for young people. They need to feel safe in order to talk with you, to open up, to express their feelings, and to be able to work through their grief process. So we talked about children's traumatic grief, and there's also another term called complicated grief. And complicated grief is accompanied by symptoms of separation, distress, and trauma, but it really lasts for a much longer extended period of time. And again, it's the failure to accomplish one or more of those reconciliation tasks. When we talk about time, I don't want to give this false understanding that it takes a year to get through the grief process or 2 years. For each individual, it is different. Each child and young adult, it's different. The developmental age is also an important factor as to how long it takes for a child to get, to heal through their grief process. In fact, they're even saying now that really healing takes a lifetime of a process. And as long as we're moving forward and making those adjustments, we're on the right path. But if we get stuck in one of these tasks that we're not able to accomplish, for instance, if the person starts having a setback by maybe abusing drugs, or may start destroying their relationships with others, then this is turning into complicated grief, where they don't seek support or help, or they're not functioning in the way that they should be. But this is really over an extended period of time that we see a slow regress of the child or the youth's development. And so grief, bereavement, and trauma can all collide at once and lead to major depressive episodes, panic disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, all kinds of mental health complications. And it's when we see both or all three of these, it's advisable often that we resolve trauma issues before we begin to address the grief. So in order to help the individual. Let me talk a little bit about childhood development, the human danger response, which really this exists in us all, and adaptation. So these are sometimes the reactions that we see as a result of our fear when death occurs. These are the signs and symptoms, which are the stress reaction that may last a few days, weeks, and even longer sometimes for each individual. It is the fight, flight, or freeze response. And many of you, I'm sure, has heard of this. The fight is that physical arousal that we often experience as a result of the fear of feeling endangered. If we think about the primitive story of the caveman and the lion, he sees the lion and he has an initial thought of fear and being in danger. And, you know, he has a chemical, the brain gives off a chemical response in order to prepare him to protect himself. So our bodies go through this experience. It's a human experience anytime we experience a threat. And so the fight is a physical arousal. The flight is a sense to withdraw and escape, to become safe and to avoid the situation. And freeze is like a stilling and a constriction. It's almost like freezing in a sense to rethink, to almost like disappear, and it's also an overwhelming sense of many of our chemical responses in our bodies that enables us to even move, to think, or to react. And so when information is labeled as dangerous with this description here, a rapid mobilization occurs in the body, and the brain signals the release of neurotransmitters that's responsible for rapidly increasing the arousal. As these are pumped into the body, our heart rate increases, our sensory systems become hyper alert for further cues of danger, and all non-essential tasks are disengaged. Those that are not relevant or immediate to survival. So for example, the amygdala becomes very activated, and that is where our fight or flight response kicks in the back part of the brain, and the hippocampus, and releases adrenaline and endorphins and cortisols into our bloodstream that prepares us for that fight or flight. That's why, for instance, an example here, crossing a street and you see a car coming fast, you immediately react before you really think. So the prefrontal cortex, the logic, the thinking is sort of slowed down in the process of the fight or flight response. You don't have time to think before you react because your body is responding in an emergency or an alarm state. And oftentimes you'll see young people, you know, immediately want to fight before thinking about talking about the situation, or they will immediately attack someone before they even think to do, you know, to reason and get an explanation why someone has said something to them. And so when we talk about the fight or flight response, this is the body's response to the internal alarm that kicks in. You know, the heart rate beats fast and the blood pressure goes up. These are all the effects that play an important role in the body, but we don't quite understand the symptoms that we feel as a result of this alarm being on. When people complain, or young people complain of having panic attacks, you can see why. Because their internal alarm, the fight or flight or freeze response, has kicked in, because their body is actually experiencing everything that you see here. The heart is beating fast. So this oftentimes creates the panic attack. They can complain of stomach aches. Well, the digestive system really shuts down anytime we are in a state of fear. And it can cause stomach problems, headaches, and migraines. You can see that the blood flows to the brain very quickly when we are stressed, and it can create pressure. The problem with all of this is that we have been able to, our bodies are equipped to handle all of this, but it's not supposed to remain on for an extended period of time. And these are some of the things that young people will complain about when they are in the alarm state: increased moodiness, withdrawal, difficulty concentrating. Remember, the frontal cortex actually is shut down, so they can't think or concentrate. They may be annoyed easily, and some of these other symptoms that you see here. This is when the internal alarm is on. We're able to adjust and to adapt to all of this. And what happens initially after the alarm kicks in, if we can feel a sense of safety, then the body can return to its resistant state. What do I mean by that? So say the caveman climbs up in a tree, he's away from danger now. And then as soon as he can feel safe or think that he's safe or perceive that he is safe, then the brain will then signal the hormones to be decreased in the blood system or the circulatory system, and the body will return to its normal state. So let's talk a little bit about this, because this is an important part of understanding and supporting a young person who might be really acting out or being in a state of alarm. The first initial thing we need to do is to help them feel safe, to calm them down and to help them feel safe in the moment. And hopefully you have a rapport that you can do that with them. But this is the only thing that is going to turn the alarm down, is to help the individual feel safe. So that's why some of these practices that we utilize today, like mindfulness and meditation and deep breathing and listening to music, ask young people what calms them down, what makes them feel better when they are stressed. And these are the things that you can practice or they can put in their toolbox to help them to reduce some of this stress and the grief reaction. We don't want the alarm to stay on too long for the mere reason it could lead to exhaustion, it can lead to sickness, poor health, disease, and even death. And so now I'd like to share this video with you.
So I want to talk for a minute about how to teach the brain. One of the really important things that we know in trauma is that when we help people understand the injury trauma creates in the brain and help them understand how that impacts the way they respond to other events in the world, it really helps them and their families move forward in their healing. So lots of people have given ways to teach the brain. As a practitioner myself, I've taken a lot of the models from Dr. Dan Siegel, taken models from the Hahn Foundation for teaching in the optimistic classroom, and looking at some of the things Ledoux has done, and put them together and really challenged myself and folks that I educate about practicing really teaching the brain. So when I explain this to teenagers, I start with the hand model, okay? And I start by explaining that we're going to talk about the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain that everyone has. Formally, this is called the limbic system, and this is called the cerebral cortex. But what we're going to talk is downstairs brain and upstairs brain. So in your downstairs brain, this is where fight, flight, or freeze lives, okay? When threat comes at you, your body has 3 reactions it can make. It can fight, it can run away, or it can stay very still until the danger's gone. That's what this brain does, okay? This part of the brain. What's up here, the upstairs brain, its job, among many other things, is to solve problems, to help you calm down, solve problems, okay? And to tell the downstairs brain, I got this. We're gonna be okay. There's another solution. So what happens a lot of times to kids who've experienced trauma is, if you think about these like muscles, because you've gone through a lot of threat, this downstairs part of the brain's been doing push-ups your whole life, okay? So this part of the brain's really strong. The part of your brain that solves problems hasn't had as much exercise because you've had to be really strong to be a survivor, a thriver. So what happens is that the brain gets what I call emotionally hijacked. This downstairs brain comes up on top of this brain, it takes over, okay? So the downstairs brain's in control. And so you fight, you run, you freeze. The only things that work when you're down here are things that calm you down. So they call them self-regulation skills. And that happens from connection. Somebody talking to you, helping you breathe, helping you feel your body calm down. Once that happens, then the upstairs brain can come back, and then you can solve problems. So that's how I try to explain to teenagers the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain, and what happens to them when they experience a threat. With young children, what I've found is they like animals. When I say young, probably 3 to 8 years old. Sometimes teenagers like it too. And so what we call this is the downstairs brain, that threat center again, is what I call the barking dog. If If you think about when any noise or threat makes, usually a dog will bark. So this is the barking dog, okay? A problem solver is often called the wise owl. So upstairs is the wise owl, downstairs is the barking dog, okay? When the dog barks, the owl flies away. And so when the dog's barking, the only things they can do are maybe practice blowing bubbles, maybe practice breathing deeply, things that help the dog start calming down. And that's where you build their self-care strategies. They practice lots of different things to help the dog stop barking. The first skill being recognizing when their dog barks. Once they learn how to calm the barking dog, then the owl flies back, and then they can come up with solutions. And again, they're trying to get this muscle stronger. The problem for most people who are intervening, if you're talking to a family, most parents are going to naturally start with redirection and consequences for negative behavior. That's the first place they go. They're shaking fingers and telling somebody, stop that, you need to do this. That's an upstairs brain intervention, while most children who've experienced trauma are downstairs. So the term Siegel uses is you connect, then you redirect. The only thing that will calm a barking dog or the downstairs brain is helping that child calm down. And only then, once you teach the child to calm down, can you engage the part of the brain that solves problems and actually come up with solutions for better behavior choices. And that's why it's important to respond to the need, respond to the safety needs that get kicked up by threat, and not just react to the behavior that happens.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in understanding the upstairs, downstairs brain and how we can help best young people to deal with those reactive responses that they might have. So we talk about toxic stress. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Veronica mentioned this, that toxic stress, which is a result of having too much of the internal alarm or that fight or flight response happening over a long period of time, can also show an impact on the development. It can derail the development of a child's brain. And so we need to be mindful that children living in too stressful environments can also be very dangerous and unhealthy. So when people's lives suddenly and drastically change by destructive events, the experience is more than what they can integrate. There's feelings of personal control, competence, security, and safety are all greatly diminished. They view the environment and other people as unsafe. They're on guard and ready for danger at all times. Social withdrawal and isolation, hypervigilance, and unlikely to seek assistance with their distress. And so again, we've talked about these maladaptive behaviors already that we see in grief. Well, it just becomes that much more extreme when the stress is prolonged. Elements that make any stress traumatic or loss traumatic is the suddenness, if it's a violent death, a human-caused event, suffering, physical or emotional of a loved one, unnaturalness, something that might have been preventable. The intent of the responsible agent. We're unfortunately hearing of such tragedies as, fathers killing mothers and vice versa. Randomness, the multiple losses, one's own personal relationship with the major loss, untimeliness, or loss of a child oftentimes is traumatic. So, we talk about post-traumatic stress. Well, there's also an opportunity for post-traumatic growth. And there is a possibility that strengths can be gained in a traumatic experience as well. And this is where we want to help lead our young people in the choices that they can make. Most people don't realize that they have a choice, that even in a traumatic event, there can be some lessons learned and some positive gains in those experiences. And so to help them see the choices that they can either self-destruct, they can have relationship problems, they can, lead down this wrong path of retaliation and substance abuse. There's also another alternative choice where they can seek opportunities and learn, make meaning out of their experiences that we talked about before. They can make something good out of even a bad experience. We have that human possibility. I call it the gift of the spirit. We can discover our own purpose in life, and we can seek peace and consolation as a result of it. And so it's encouraged that every corporation, business, human service provider learn more about trauma-informed care, because we have a great risk of re-traumatizing individuals that come to us to be served. And this means maintaining safety and transparency with them, recognizing widespread and multiple losses, understanding the path to recover that may be different for each individual, to help them integrate the trauma in their, in your practices, integrate trauma-informed care in your practices that you provide for individuals. For instance, understanding cultural differences, understanding the inequities in healthcare and social economics and things of that nature that people are dealing with today. And these are the ways in which we resist re-traumatizing individuals. And so it is important that we recognize that the central question has to change. It's not what's wrong with these individuals, but who is this child, youth, and what have they experienced, and what do they bring to the table with us? What do they believe is true? Their perception must be acknowledged.
So to end our time together, we wanted to make sure we give you some things to put in your own toolbox. So if you are dealing with young people who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, here's some tips. We ask you to pay more attention to what is happening right now, helping the child and the youth with their grief. Help them to understand their emotions, what's going on inside of them. Dr. Siegel talks about helping kids to name it so they can tame it. We want to help our children notice all of their thoughts, their feelings, and behaviors without judgment. As professional caretakers, it's important that we help them feel more in control, to choose their behaviors and make their own decisions. This is about empowerment. We want to ask questions to help provide words for their feelings. Our job is to help reduce stress and anxiety for our youth that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, and to begin helping them to identify positive, healthy coping skills. So as providers, it is important that we meet them where they are. We need to look beyond the behavior. What's going on beyond the surface? Maintain confidentiality. Again, safety, trustworthiness is part of that trauma-informed care. It's important to listen for safety concerns from our children. Please ask those open-ended questions and listen to their responses. We want to meet them by encouraging them to share their thoughts and their feelings. Avoid those why questions. It places our young people on defense. Avoid advice giving, because our job is to listen and to empower, assist in their problem solving. Allow for silence. We know that silence can be therapeutic. Important for us as professional caregivers to listen with an open heart and not bring our biases to the table. And we want to meet our young people by always asking them, who can they talk to? What person or people in their environment that can help them to get through and help them with the grief process. Additionally, we want to recognize and support our young people. Again, offer physical support to them. It's important that we give them some type of routine, especially for young children. And you may want to ask questions over and over, because definitely they will too. We encourage our young people here to ask those questions. Talk about your narrative. They may regress, cling, and that to you, and that talked about that earlier. It's important to educate our parents so that they know what's going on. Deaf play is fine. We encourage that. We know children communicate through play. We want to be honest and don't tell half truth. And I just want to quickly say, one of the things we talk to our caretakers here is to be honest. Use that language, deaf, dying. You know, many of us use words like mommy went to sleep, daddy went to sleep. Depending on the age of the child, the language, this can be more detrimental and really can re-traumatize. We provide words for the feelings. Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling angry? Recognize and reassure the child is not responsible for the death, especially when it's dealing with suicide, or a child may say something. I had a young lady who told her father before she left the school, she wished he would die. Unfortunately, he was robbed, murdered. And this is something that she dealt with, that whole remorse, that survivor guilt. Allow time for our young people to work through their grief and offer constructive venting. All tools that we can take as professionals. Here are some useful facilitation tools that we use here. And that talked about memory boxes, photos. Please make that available. Writing letters to the special person, encouraging those young people that, you know, it doesn't matter how you spell, doesn't matter what you do. This is about writing a letter to your special person, keeping journals. We have our young people as well as our adults decorate their journals. Drawing. A lot of times we don't have the words that can share how we're feeling. So drawing, art-based learning is something that we promote here. Role play, allow the young person the opportunity to role play in order to reduce the fear or the anxiety. You know, we found that mindfulness works very well. Healthy eating, all of our programs that deal with children, we provide a balanced meal. Exercise, balance with rest helps with the healing process. Also, just quickly, we want you to be careful what you can say as a professional caregiver. Here are some do's and don'ts. I'm just going to go over a couple. I know how you feel. Please avoid that. Don't cry. We promote crying here. Crying is therapeutic. What you can say, I'm sorry for your loss. I wish I had the right words. Just know I care. I don't know how you feel, but I'm here to help in any way I can. Time heals. Just give me some time. Stay away from those type of language to our children. Sometimes just saying nothing and just being with the young person is what they need. All tools that we can use and moving forward, and that we can move forward. So remember, seek to be taught. You would never know the depth of the generational losses as professional caretakers. Recognize our boundaries in the work that we do. It is important that we offer tools to take back into the community. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about giving our young people the tools so when they go back into the community, perhaps they can help their peers as well, because we know they have that informal rumor mill that can help the young people. We want to avoid judgment. Please, when you're working with children that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma, it can trigger things in us. We bring our own biases. Please be aware of that. And remember, mental illness remains a stigma. Grief, loss, and trauma can deal with disenfranchised grief. So please listen as a way to work with our young people as part of your tools. We ask that you listen to another soul into conditions of disclosure and discovery may be almost the greatest service any human being ever performs for another, just listening. And instead of ignoring loss and trauma or moving quickly past them, we can choose to slow down, sit with each loss, examine it, and grieve it. It is better to sink in and experience it now than to find yourself drowning years later in losses that had no voice. So as professional caretakers, we also discussed earlier that young people have experienced losses, almost 70, I think the data we showed earlier, 730,000 children die each year. And before we end our time today, if we just can take just a moment of silence for those young people that have died and those young people that we work with that are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma. We thank you for allowing us to have that moment of silence for the children who are dealing with grief, loss, and trauma.
Great. Thank you so much, Annette and Veronica. We surely enjoyed that information. We're at about time, but if you have any questions, I'm sure the presenters, they provided their contact information earlier in the slides. And we'll also be sending everyone here a PDF copy of the slides and the recording, which will be posted on the exchange. I'll go ahead and pop into the chat an evaluation link. If you could go to that and just tell us how you enjoyed the webinar, we certainly appreciate it. But thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope that you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing us to present.